Sweet. Okay, book club. Um, doing part two now of Bertrand Russell's outline of philosophy. But today we're gonna have dear Daniel, a friend who did his a lot of studying, a lot more studying on Russell and Wittgenstein than I have. So he's gonna do a little bit of the talking to summarize the stuff in part two. So take it away, basically.
All right, so I'll do a pretty brief overview, and then if people have specific questions about some sections, I can dive deeper in. Um, if I just summarize the 60 pages into 3 points, you get three main claims that I think Russell's trying to make. And keep in mind that the majority of these claims are supported through sort of like this data of physics, which is pretty heavily outlaid through the first, I believe, two or three parts, and then some philosophy sparsed in through. So the three claims, they build off each other. The first proposition is we look at the world through sense data, and this gives us indirect access to the world. I'll dive a little deeper into each claim after, but the second claim is the raw sense data represents the chaos of the external world, which we make sense of as a form of inference. And the inference looks like uh, abstract concepts like persistence, continuity, unity, those types of things. Third one is we assume the world is objective due to shared experiences, and our inferences also reinforce this objective sense. And I think he's in that specific party, that specific claim, he's trying to heavily imply that this is this sense of objectivity at least detracts from our experience in some way, or is some way misleading. Um, so in terms of the inference, or in terms of like looking at the world through sense data, he uses physics to reinforce this point. So he says something along the lines of science and experience derive knowledge from indirect experience. So he's pretty clear that when we're looking at the world, we rather than seeing the external world, we have the sense data that we access, and that sense data represents the external world in some way. He uses the example of an atom. I believe the essentially where we don't actually see the electrons in an atom and moving and whatnot, or like where they are. The way that we detect them is that there's when energy leaves or energy is absorbed by the atom, then we can make inferences based on the amount of energy that went into or out of the system. And he thinks that that's a pretty accurate model for the external world. There's a quote that I think really encompasses this. So he says, in places where there are no eyes or ears or brains, there are no colors or sounds. But there are events having certain characteristics which lead them to cause colors and sounds in places where there are eyes and ears and brains. There's another quote that I think, where did I put this? That I think gets at it really well. This is by another philosopher named G. E. Moore. But when I read that, I thought he had a very similar quote. He says, "We might say the word yellow. Uh, we might say that yellow is a set of photons in a specific sequence, reflecting off a thing. However, that is not what we mean when we say yellow. When we say yellow, we mean the experience of yellow, the thing which we experience when those photons are arranged so. Even if I could communicate with absolute accuracy the specific arrangement of photon particles that correspond to yellow to a blind person, I would have failed to communicate the meaning of yellow." And I think that's a really good point because a lot of the words that we use in our language to refer to the external world don't actually refer to it, they refer to our experience. And I think that's a good sort of evidence for what Russell's trying to get at. Um, and so after the inference, we get to what does that inference actually look like? And so this is where Russell's saying that it isn't just that we have access have access to the sense data, which the sense data represents the external world. It's that this raw sense data is in some sort of chaotic order that we have to make sense. I think a really rough way of thinking about it is if you have 5 assignments, ultimately you're going to have to pick one assignment to start doing first, and that's kind of the idea where uh, whichever assignment you pick first is probably going to be slightly better because you had more time, more time to plan out and look what that assignment was going to feel like. to do and the quality of your writing. And it's kind of the same thing where our brain has to make a choice to how it presents things, and ultimately whatever arrangement it chooses to present those things to you in your experience is going to affect your experience of the external world. So excuse me. So he thinks that the way that the brain does this is through concepts like force and causality, and he thinks that these concepts are reinforced by repeated events. So the more you see, when you're playing catch with your dad growing up, the more you're throwing the ball around and you see the path of that ball, it reinforces the idea of causality, for example. Um, and you can clearly tell that Russell's really concerned with persistence continuity specifically when he's referring to this. He brings in Adams again to talk about persistence and continuity. So there's a Latin saying. He says in Latin it says that science makes no jumps. That there's always a sort of like causal chain linking everything. But Russell thinks that's not the case with atoms, for example, where we can't actually see the path of an electron in orbit of an atom in movement. What we can do is we can take a photo of it and we can catch it in one place at a time, but we can never see it moving. We're just going to catch it in multiple instances, sort of like a stop motion animation film. John Carlos can probably explain that better in a bit, because I think he's got much more background knowledge on this than that. But that's kind of what he's going at when it comes to persistence and continuity. And something else, think of it like unity, where other people exist in the external world and they're there, but you don't just see them as is. They're a composite of your experiences with them, and that makes up your perception of that person as a totality. And I think that's a good way of showing how, rather than experiencing the person as that raw data, you have some sense of unity which that person is bound under. The quote that he says that I think exemplifies this, he says, "We have to change our notion both of substance and of cause. To say that an atom persists is like saying that a tune persists. If a tune takes 5 minutes to play, we do not conceive of it as a single thing which exists throughout that time, but as a series of notes. And it is so related as to form a unity. In the case of the tune, the unity is aesthetic. In the case of an atom, it's causal." So I think that he's just really talking about how the fact that you don't think, if you hear a series of notes, you think of them as not as the notes individually, but rather as the totality of the notes' relation to each other. And in that sense, he's really making the claim that we make sense of the external world through that. And then just a little bit about the objectivity part. This part I think was a little bit less clear to me, at least. But I think he's essentially trying to say that we are the nature of our experiences reinforce the fact that we feel that it's objective. So one of the quotes that I think he says that really gets at this, he says, "Another reason for objectivity of the impressions we derive from another reason for the objectivity of our impressions is what we derive from sight. That is the correlation with other senses, especially touch. Through this correlation, we soon get to know that a man 20 yards away is really just as big as a man who is 1 yard away." And I think in that sense, that ability of our brain to have that pattern recognition, combined with the fact that other people reinforce this this notion, makes us feel like our experiences are ultimately objective. And a small minor point that he says is that we tend to always move towards this sort of objective view of the world unless we're explicitly trying to do something, unless we're explicitly trying to do the opposite of that, like an artist would. So in all those things, I think there's a few key mechanisms that we can identify from Russell's arguments. I think that there's two things that Russell's arguments are contingent on. One is that the inference of X is actually distinctly of X. Actually, three things. One is that the inference of X is actually distinctly different than X. Or sufficiently different that it makes us doubt the extent of knowledge that we can actually derive from that inference. And the third one is that we can actually talk about this sort of lack the sort of indirect and direct acquaintance with the external world, which is something, I'll probably have something to say a bit about it near the end. And then the last bit, before I hand it back to you, Chris, is that I think that something that I noted that was really interesting was that I think we feel that Russell's arguments are compelling in this capacity because the statement that our acquaintance with the external world is incorrect makes us feel like it's less valuable or in some way illegitimate to external law, to having rather than having the direct knowledge, quote unquote. But yeah, go. I have some questions prepared too, but if we go into discussion, that's also perfectly fine.
Yeah, sure. I just like the one thing that I want to get filled in on a tiny bit because I couldn't make it to the last book club, but you guys were talking
Yeah,
about um defining the atom, for instance, and relativity, which was pretty hot and new at the time, or like Einsteinian relativity. And you explained like pretty nicely that yeah, atoms, they used to be thought of as these types of like undividable little components of matter that you can touch and that can do little things. But then it was come to be understood, or it came to be understood that really they're a lot more ghostly, or a lot more like what does he call them? Yeah, he calls them like more ghostly than originally thought. And that when we're studying these atoms, or when we're trying to observe these atoms, it's not the atoms themselves we're looking at, it's the radioactive decay, or like the impacts they have on like other types of stuff that we can take a look at and then be like, and then draw some types of inferences and so on. But at the beginning of that chapter, he asks basically, what is matter? And this was a pretty big topic in like a recent philosophy of mind course I had. So I wanted to ask you guys, just like to like, what, maybe you're talking about it before, but just like intuitively, when I ask you like what is matter, what's the first thing that comes to mind, or how do you define it?
I have a technical answer. Um, a disturbance in a kind of field that is self-persistent.
Because there's a lot of ways you can approach that question, or at least that are like common ways to approach that question. And one, for example, is just like the commonsensical, if you can point at it, um you can say, look, that's a glass, look, that's a table, then that means it's matter. But there's other things that also seem to be matter, but we can't really see or point at. That explanation doesn't work too nicely. Then there's the like by negation. You can say, oh, okay, well, what is matter is just, or we can say what is not matter, basically. Okay, what is not matter? It's like things we cannot observe or measure. Um, and then you can just defer it to the physicists and be like, okay, well, philosophy has no stake in this game. We can't really say anything about it. Just let the physicists decide what matter is, and then we'll go off of that. But the issue with that one, at least, I think, is that if we just say, okay, physicists figure out what matter is, um, we know that physics is an incomplete picture. And it's super clear in this book, at least, that it's something that's still evolving, still developing. General relativity is still like butting heads with quantum theory in a lot of ways. Like, we just have an incomplete picture of physics. So to ask them to define something like matter and then expect an explanation that's not going to change in the next 20 years, that just seems like a little like cheap. Like, like we're not making any progress there. Um, but then also just not giving an answer, that seems like unsatisfying. So I don't know. I was stuck on while reading like the rest of the chapters and stuff, but I still wasn't able to fully wrap my head around what matter was, or how to understand it if it's not in this type of like indivisible unit. Call it a proton or a neutron or anything like smaller. Um, but yeah, if it's not that stuff, what the heck is matter?
To the best of our knowledge, it is indivisible at a given point, right now, of course. On the quark level, that is. Quarks, electrons, photons. That's, well, to the best of our knowledge right now.
Yeah, these elementary particles are supposedly undivisible or indivisible.
I mean,
And
the atom was
indistinguishable
also
as well.
the atom was also held to be indivisible, and like the atom as a totality itself of the protons, neutrons was held to be indivisible at one point, wasn't it? Or
Yeah, it was. And that's
Yeah,
why it's a little. I don't want to say like naive because that sounds like derogatory. I just feel like it's like it just seems a little bit like silly to think that, oh no, it's at the quark level where it just stops being divisible when we were wrong so many times in the
to the
past.
best of our knowledge.
Yeah, to the best of our knowledge.
It could be further split maybe at higher energies, but we don't know right now. So
Mm-hmm.
I'll
but
give.
I have a funny comment regarding permanence and specifically for photons. So, a photon is an oscillation of electromagnetic field, right? But the thing about it is that if you just take it's a self-feeding thing. As electric field decreases, the magnetic field increases perpendicularly due to Maxwell equations. So it's a phenomena which sustains itself through time due to Maxwell equations. But this thing, we call it, we let's say, the permanence of a photon is basically the fact that it fits itself back and forth between electric field and magnetic field, but there's no further permanence to it. It's not a thing. It's just a self-feeding loop of stuff.
Well, I think what it would be, or at least what Russell would try and say, is that it, even if it is a self-feeding loop thing, as you're mentioning, it has at one point an impression on a person or observer or thing that's measuring it, and then it's through that that we understand it. It's like through the impression or experience that it leaves for a person at a person time, but not for itself in that time, if I'm understanding correctly.
Well, I mean, yes, psychologically, I mean, we can even give permanence to a rabbit, and that's not a single unit. It's hair goes off all the time. I mean, something that is actually permanent, even something that is permanent on a fundamental level is just permanent, quote quote. Not really. It's just self-feeding stuff of electric and magnetic field. So that's the best permanence we can actually get, and it's I mean it's just a self-feeding loop of fields, not a stuff, not a concrete stuff.
I don't see that as being necessarily problematic. I feel like uh, something. I think two things. One, I think Russell would say something along lines in regards to photons that for are when you see your room light up, when you see uh, when you open your blinds, when you see a shadow, that all these things are a facet of your relationship with photons. That the sort of like that's the sense data expression of photons. And in regards to like the permanent stuff, I don't think it's particular. I guess let me get some clarification. Are you saying that if we call photons that is in some way indicative of other faults within the theory or another theory?
No, not at all. It's just an illustration of what you were pointing at. Um, and Russell's attempt at defining permanence as try to reduce the time between the time, let's say, consider two instants that are very nearby, and our impression of permanence is due to that in very small time, not many changes occur. So we say that
Mm.
you see the thing again that hasn't changed very much apparently. So we construct an idea of permanence. Yeah. Just in the same manner, we can, in the case of the photon, we can, let's say, have a more detailed picture of what's going on, what kind of permanence is happening. So it's just an illustration. I don't really think it's a counter argument or anything.
Gotcha.
And maybe a similar thing could happen with the electron, but we don't have the physics yet. Or with all particles, because they all behave wave-like anyway. That's string theory in the end.
No, go for it. Go for it.
That's string theory. Fields oscillate, and those are particles.
Yeah. Correct. I was thinking about. So he gives the example. What was it of It's like kids can be shown an image of a cat, or like on stained glass or something like that. They can all be presented with this image of a cat, given that they know what a cat is. And then even if some kids are further away, some kids are closer, some kids are wearing glasses, it's darker for some kids, whatever, they can all point at that thing and say cat. So there seems to be like this filter between the concept of a cat and the physical thing that's evoking that thought, or that like that concept, or that representation, if you want to call it that. And how far can this, I don't know, it just seems to me that this representation, like when we say cat and we're looking at an image, it's almost as if like we're grasping at something that doesn't exist, since we can look at cat in so many different forms and shapes and then still pull out the catness from it. Like even if cat is just in words, even if it's a black cat or an orange cat, it can be so different in so many ways, but we all still point at it and think cat. How does that work?
So that is, I would say, almost that's very similar to a lot of what Wittgenstein says, in the sense that I would break it down into two parts. One is that he has what's called a photo theory of language. So when you say, I put it, when you take a photo of something, say you take a photo of arrangement of furniture, the photo is a representation of the relationships that the spatial relationships that each piece of furniture have with each other. And if you either change the furniture or move it slightly or something, you can still see some likeness in it, and that is through the relationships that they have. Similarly, he thinks that the meanings of words are photos, in the sense that every instance of the word cat has something similar with every other instance of every other word cat. But whatever it is that it has in common with every other cat isn't something that's particularly communicable in language. I think the more like analytical way to describe it would be that the like, if you were to actually find the definition of the word cat, if you wanted a full account of what the thought cat meant, you would need an account which has every proposition, which is essentially a truth function. He believes that all propositions are truth functions, essentially. So all propositions which have the word cat in it, and they're essentially they're the totality of all these propositions, with the outcome of each proposition either being true or false, and that sort of determination in the sense that whether or not that proposition, in what he would say, whether it obtains, quote unquote, and that just means that does the state of affairs mean that a cat that truth function is true or false.
So then, but isn't there an infinite amount of propositions that you could make with the word cat, meaning that we could never wholly explain cat?
I mean, it'd probably be infinite, but it's just to the point, like, that is essentially the account, like that is the totality of the account of the word cat and what that word
And
means.
it seems like that we cannot have, or we cannot give a totality of an account of the word cat, since there's an infinite amount of propositions that can obtain that term. And I think that was like
I disagree there.
sorry.
Uh, I disagree there based on, okay, I think it's an imperfection of our language, but it doesn't mean that we cannot convey what a cat is in non-human language, considering how image classifiers currently work to detect whether something is a cat or another animal. The way this is done is by trying to process a lot of images and try to convey into a bottleneck of information what helps you classify one image from another. And this bottleneck is important. So you force the machine to try to express in a few words let's say, as possible, what makes one picture a cat and what makes a picture a dog. And this
I don't.
bottleneck of information is what allows you to classify. So
So
it has to be less information than the number of pixels, for instance.
I would say 'cause what you're describing to me sounds like a neural network, in the sense that you
Yep.
feed a neural network, a photo of a cat, and then it'll have so it has different like neural nodes. Those neural nodes are each assigned essentially with a task, more or less. I might be butchering this. I have limited info on neural network. So my understanding is that each neural node has a task. That neural network or that neural node will then pass on that task to another neural network, and it'll assign this sort of like vector value to the outcome of that task. So it's to say, does it have like does this have a tail? And there will be a fixed value of what that means. Every word will get assigned a value, a numerical value, and then over time you will train that neural network by feeding it cats. It'll give you an output, and then you will have it correct itself. So you'll just put in like how much it should correct itself by, and over time you sort of refine that neural network and that model until it gives you an accurate outcome.
But here's the
Go
But the
ahead.
thing,
point
that network will never be perfect. It's pragmatically functioning, right? Like it will basically always say, does it have these certain features? Are these certain features different? Correct yourself. But like at one point, you can be really sneaky with it and feed it a Photoshop picture of cookies, but it looks like a cat or something like that, and then it'll say cat. I think this is more like a conditioned reflex, like Russell would be saying, as opposed to understanding what cat is.
I think his point is not so much that we is that when we use the word cat, that invokes a thought. That thought is a picture of every uh, relationship I've had with a I don't want to say a cat, but a cat, a thing which has the thing that all cats have. It sounds, I think, a little bit convoluted,
I'm
but
following
the
you, yeah.
idea is that thing is uh, there is something which every cat has. I'm never going to experience every cat such that I will, get a full picture, but I can certainly pick up on what are the things that all cats have, and that sort of pattern recognition is what gives me this the word cat, and that word and that thought, that meaning that I invoke in language is a picture of all those things. It's a sort of, and it's not just a picture of the cat, but it's a representation of my relationship to that cat. In the same way that when you take a photo of a a room of furniture, you know something about the person who took the photo. Not like intimately, but you know something about their three-dimensional relationship to the items in the photo. And so I think like it's not so problematic that we'll never. I guess I'll say I don't think that phrasing it as if we can't ever read all the propositions which include the cat as a truth function, that we can then not know what a cat is. I think it's more accurate to say that uh, you won't ever become acquainted with every cat, and I
I
think
think it's
that
fair to say like
makes
we
it feel
cannot
less problematic.
tautologically know that it's a cat, or like know that it'll be a cat, but we can practically and pragmatically, with almost perfect certainty, be able to identify the cat. At least that's what
I
like.
would say, sorry, I guess like the very nitpicky answer would be to say we can know, uh, uh, we can identify whatever it is that we see as all cats having in common.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. That stuff bugs me a lot, as you can tell. Like the complete certainty stuff. Yeah. What other things, well, aside from cats, stood out to you guys?
I have a question. I've been for a long time. I'm trying to think about the relation between the logical A then B versus causality between an A and a B.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have first order logic and A implies B, and then that doesn't mean that A is a cause and B is a consequence. In fact, it could be A then B, and A be the cause, or it could be A then B and B be the cause. Right? There's a certain disconnection between first order logic A then B and cause effect relationship between two events.
Yeah, that's getting very like Humean. Um, it's more appropriate, I guess, to say that like it just happens to be the case that when there is A, B follows, as opposed to A causes B. And then we use inference to like draw those causal rules or those causal laws. I think he talks about that in what, like chapter
Yeah, chapter 9, I think.
maybe chapter 8. I don't know, my book's mess.
Chapter 11.
11. Yeah. Causation and how it's understood commonsensically. He talks about like this compulsion or this anthropomorphism of causation, and then he kind of thinks that force is I really like his or I thought it was really funny his like Hindu example or the little discussion where it's like you ask the Hindu like what's supporting the earth, and he says the elephant, and then what supports the elephant, he says the tortoise, but then what supports the tortoise, and the guy just says, well, let's just like change the topic or talk about something else. And that's what happens, or that's kind of what happens in physics when we talk about forces. It's like what's causing the force of gravitation to be the force of gravitation, or the speed of light to be the constant, which it is. Um, we just don't know. We stop questioning at that point.
Okay, so here's the full comment I wrote down because I have a larger question than that, and this is just the start. So Russell at some point says that textbooks say A is the cause of B if A is necessarily followed by B.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he writes that.
Yes.
Yeah, at least he says that textbooks say that.
Mm-hmm.
So probably he's about to say that this is not fully accurate, but the thing so again, A is the cause of B, A is necessarily followed by B. And I have a few comments regarding that. First, that wasn't exactly a definition
Mm-hmm.
because it's not an if and only if.
Yes.
And okay, but another comment is okay, so maybe I don't know if this will get confusing because it's an over analysis of the phrase. Maybe I'm going to skip question 2. Okay, so the other thing is that correlation does not imply causation. So, and first order logic expresses correlation.
I think it's first is maybe I'm misunderstanding, but first or this type of correlation is like I think he's only talking about in the physical world, not in like the realm of logic. Um, or is he equivocating logic in the physical world? I don't know what's going on there with that. That's a good question.
If you say A is necessarily followed by B,
Mm-hmm.
this is a first order logic phrase.
Yeah.
Whereas if you say A is the cause of B, this is not a first order logic phrase. And so he says A is the cause of B if A is necessarily followed by B. And this is not exactly true because you might have a necessary cause or a necessary consequence. Say A that always causes B, or B that is always caused by A.
So I think what he's talking
You
about
see?
here is the use of the word cause, or like how the word cause is generally used, because the word cause is generally used a lot more loosely than the word necessary is used in logic. It's very strict in logic what like necessary means. It's like A then B, or A therefore, like it's just like it's like a strict uh definition of what it can be. But when we're talking about, oh, this caused that, or like me being hungry caused me to go eat, it's a lot more loose and it's a lot more like inferentially bound, I want to say, than than necessity in logic. So I think it's just like the way we're using the words that he's hinting at. But I don't know. What do you think, Daniel? That's just like how I
Okay.
get it.
No, I think this is the sort of a miscommunication here, where I think it's the question of, is he using cause in some the objective, philosophical way, or is it the practical sense of, I've picked up this ball and thrown it across my living room 100 times. I'm now inferring that I am the cause of this ball moving. And I think there's that practical sense where, for all intents and purposes, I can operate as if I were the cause. And then there's the semantical discussion of, am I actually the cause, or can I actually infer from these, or determine from these instances that I'm a cause? I think those are two separate circumstances. And I guess, as you mentioned, Chris, I think technically there would be the third one, which I think is the logical, if A equals, if A then B.
I think you might be right, because indeed in his phrase he puts the word necessarily between quotes. So it's probably not the first order logic necessarily, but rather, let's say, colloquial necessary.
Colloquial, yeah. And that's
Yeah, I think you're right there.
something to always look out
I,
for.
I still have the question. I still have the question though, between the relationship between first order logic and cause consequence. At least when you say that A then B, it might even be possible that, let's say you could say A then B with causality in A. Let's say you drop something and it hits the floor. Simple.
Mhm.
I dropped something, and because I dropped it, it hit the floor. Or maybe A then B with causality in B. For instance, this person made a home run because someone else threw a ball, right? If you do a home run, then necessarily someone threw you a ball.
I wouldn't say that the throwing of the ball was the cause, but a necessary condition of for the cause to happen. Like if it were not for the ball being
So,
thrown, then there would not have been a home
so
run.
cause someone threw a ball and you made a home run,
The effect was the
but
home run,
the
but there are
but
necessary
in first order
conditions.
logic, yeah, you would say I made a home run, then someone threw a ball. That's necessary.
Mhm.
So if you want to say cause and effect as A arrow B, then you would need to say in first order logic B arrow A,
Yeah.
because that's the necessary.
No, because there must be when we're talking about like real life stuff, there's a relationship between the events that happen. Or in other words, like a before and an after, or like this happened and then that happened. Um which isn't all which needs to be like unidirectional when it comes to like the real world, since time only moves in one direction, as opposed to uh a bi-directional world where like time can flow in both directions. Then we could say that B and A are bidirectionally causal or something like that, if
I
I'm
think
following.
there's this sort of, um, this is a really shitty analogy, but if you're in Minecraft and you sort of you operate, if you're in a video game, you operate within sort of rules of physics and rules of how the world works. And I think moving that outside of the world to just a same model that you use in Minecraft in the real world, building a house without concern for gravity, which doesn't exist in Minecraft, for example. There's sort of a flaw there. I don't think it's as egregious with your example, but I think there is something to say about logical, these logical models are, in my view, these sort of like Wittgenstein view would be that what A to B represent, it's not a direct correlation between either of the two examples you mentioned. Rather, it's a photo of what every instance which has that, which represents what every instance represented by that would have in common.
It,
It is the same thing with cat, but just that is what logic is essentially.
to me, it almost like it makes me think of like Plato and his forms, and that's where logic is. It's like for like those of you who guys aren't like completely familiar, Plato had this idea that there's a lot of stuff in the world that's like out there in the ether or like in the universe, and he calls these things like the forms, and we have access to them, but they're never actually like in the real world. So for example, like take something like a square, like a perfect square where it's like perfectly 90 degrees on all angles and it's perfectly two-dimensional. Like these things don't really exist. They're just instantiated in like close forms. Like I can give you like imagine this is a square. It's like this is pretty close to a square, and it's the same thing that's happening with logic, I think. Like these rules of logic, they're like they could be immutable and like just like out there and theoretically completely true, but when you apply them to like physics, cause and effect stuff happening in our world with like its limitations and imperfections, then it's no longer a perfect one-to-one representation. It's just like a really close representation, like a pictorial one almost. That's what's coming
I
to
also
mind.
think
I would say that
go ahead.
I would say that you go.
No, you go.
Okay. I would say that first order logic is incomplete to describe cause and effect. Let's say you say A then B, but it happens to be that those are two things that are a consequence of C. So C happens and it causes A and it causes B, for instance. And maybe you could say A then B if B or if B always happens. Let's say C always causes B and sometimes causes A. So if you could then say A then B, even though C is what caused both of those. So even if you say A then B, it doesn't mean that one of those is the cause. They might have a common cause.
Yeah, so here's like or this is the like interesting thing about logic. Logic is it's always true if we have all of the facts, if we know that it's just A, just B, and just C. But in the real world, when we're talking about cause and effect, there are third variables and confounding variables we can't account for. So saying that one thing causes the other thing is more of like a probabilistic um account because of all the third variables. Like it could be a ghost that we can't measure that's causing B, but it just only appears when there's A or something like that. So I don't know. To me, I separate logic and like the real world stuff a little bit, in my mind at least.
I think the one way of thinking about it would be if we were to bring logic to the real world, we would have to know the superposition of, or I don't know if that's the right word, just like the position of every atom across the board. You know, every quark, every atom, every electron. We would have to know its location at all times to be able to calculate the end result of some physical calculus.
Let's go pick the universal wave function.
What?
The universal wave function. Let's
That's a
go big.
thing?
Yeah.
God damn, that's crazy. Okay. Well, does it work?
Can we know it?
I mean, why not?
Like,
Well,
can I plug the universal?
I mean, it depends if you're subscribing to like to determinism or not. Is there a true
Yeah.
randomness when it comes to quantum theory, or is there just an apparent randomness?
Yeah. For the sake of discussion, let's assume the many world interpretation that that the universe can be a single wave function, and you're in a superposition as well.
Okay.
For fun's sake. Okay, but continue. This was just a side comment.
No. I think it's a relevant side point because this is closer to what's probably actually going on than what most philosophers have to say, at least in my view. Yeah. I guess the only other thing I wanted to say about logic is I think logic is uniquely positioned in that it represents something about the limitation of not just the world but our minds. And in that sense, I think I like to think of logic as in the Wittgenstein photo theory of language as a photo of something that every human has in common. Every human's brain has in common in the way they think. And I think that tells us a lot. In the sense that the rules of logic are almost denoting, they're carving out these borders in what a human could, what a thought could be, and what a human could think. Yeah. The specific relation to this conversation is more so just, I think that I think that makes it difficult to apply in a literal, like just almost like a transplant faction of bringing logic to the external world without what Chris was saying about knowing all the facts.
I like the way you put that logic is like carving out what can be known or what can be thought of by people. And for one reason, I think I've brought this up like multiple times, but I had a friend who was able to say that he could conceive of a round square, a contradiction, right? Said like, no, I can conceive of true contradictions. If he was being honest, if he wasn't just like lying or trying to, I don't know, get a rise out of the class, um, then that whole notion of logic being something that carves out what's possibly conceivable or understandable by people, that goes out the window. And I'm just thinking about all the times that I've come across arguments in philosophy where it says, it's conceivable that there's a philosophical zombie, or it's conceivable of this, conceivable of that. If I can't conceive of it, then what is that to say about these logical principles that are supposed to carve out everything we can think of?
Well, I think it's more so like you would have to quote unquote like breach the barrier of logic. You'd have to be able to think a thought which offended the rules of logic. And I think how do I put it? The logic, I think, specifically when it comes to philosophical examples, and Wittgenstein touches on this, it's what really matters here is what you're trying to say a state of affairs? If it's not a state of affairs, then it's not something that can be said. So when you say it's a state of affairs, you're going to say something in regards to when you make a claim, you can state a state of affairs, and then you can state a state of affairs and its truth function. That is to say, whether that state of affairs is or is not. And that's really like the sort of totality of like what can be said. So even like the zombie example would be perfectly fine. It is logically possible that a state of affairs exists where there's a zombie, this or that. But for example, a state of affairs, either for things that can't be said, it would either be something that just couldn't be a state of affairs, not for practical or feasibility restrictions, but for legitimate logical conceivability restrictions, or something that just wasn't a state of affairs. And the second part to your question, in reference to your friend who had who thought of a square circle, that whole like God argument about whether can God make a square circle, that's the first thing that comes to mind. But I think throw this at him, or in theory, I would say think of two walls in your head. Think of a wall that is the largest wall you've ever seen, ever. The largest wall, bigger than the wall of China, horizontally and vertically, chunky wall, whatever, biggest wall ever. And think of an infinite wall in your head. Now, logically, you would come to the conclusion that the infinite wall is larger than the larger wall, or the biggest wall you've conceived. We'll call it wall A being the large wall, and wall B being the infinite wall. But within your thoughts, I think you would come to the admittance that both you would be, if I put both walls in a cup and I flip them around, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Or another version.
Isn't that about cognitive limitations, or cognitive just?
I think it's definitely part of it, but I think it's also indicative of the sort of point where things like infinity, things like square circle, that sort of exceed what is containable within. I would argue that within logic and language, I think they're it's kind of like it's egregious to say that you can think of them. The alternative example, which I think might get more at your point, would be if you think of uh, two immensely powerful beings, um, Superman and then Superman, but he's infinitely powerful, and you think of them having a fight in your head. I think two or three thoughts come to mind. One, that
The Zoroastrians,
you know,
or the Manichaeans. Sorry, that the first that come to mind.
but like those, and let's say you like pit them to the death in your head, or have them fight and to have them win. You won't. I think two things. One is like you won't know what it looks like to have one of them win. I think that's one thing that kind of shows like there's something inconceivable about these things. And the second part is, it very well could be that like how you might never know who would win or might not win because the fight might go on for I don't want to say close to infinity because I know some mathematician's gonna shoot me for saying that, but they might go on for such a large amount of time that it would be indistinguishable from infinity. I think that's the point. And I think that points to something about the human limitations when it comes to these. And like I think that's like I would loop infinity in terms of speaking about it within language, not within a mathematical notation sense, as trying to speak with it would be the same thing as trying to think of a square circle,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What does it mean for something to be conceivable? As you were asking, I mean, can you conceive a universe in which 1 + 1 is not 2, or can you conceive the Saint Anselm's definition of God, for instance, which is the trap that forces you to admit its existence in his trick?
Yeah. So I asked my.
Are you asking?
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I was just asking if he was asking me or you. I didn't hear that.
Oh, yeah. I'll give my 2 cents. I asked that same question to my prof basically, and he said, well, the common understanding or like the common agreement in in philosophy for the most part is it's just like um so long as it abides by like non-contradiction and standard modal logic, then we can consider it to be conceivable. So long as something doesn't isn't a true contradiction, it is conceivable. All things that are true contradictions are not conceivable. So the person saying that I can think of a round square, they're either lying or like they're just not being totally honest, because by definition you cannot conceive by both of them if we're abiding by this type of logic. That's all I had to say.
I think
So this is not a contradiction, you say. And
I would disagree with that, specifically in reference to the math point. But I think it comes. There's twofold. There's one. There's conception as it offends logic, and there's conception as it exceeds something, like you mentioned, the cognitive limitations. And so, insofar as one of the criticisms specifically I had with Russell, I guess to bring it back to the book club discussion, but I think Russell brings up a point where he's using the word indirect to describe the relationship that we have with the external world. And I think that would fit under Wittgenstein's definition of nonsense, in the sense that the very nature of the word indirectness is defined by the word directness. The sort of the opposites of these 2 points. And so I think in that sense, for me to think of myself indirectly acquainted with a thing, I must also be able to think of myself directly acquainted with a thing. And I don't think we could realistically put forward an argument where a state of affairs exists where I'm quote unquote directly acquainted with the external world. Similarly, I don't think we could realistically put forward a state of affairs where, not because it is impossible, but I think because of the conditions of our existence, that you can call it the chains of our existence, that force us to think in this sort of sequential numerical way. A universe could not exist where 1 + 1 equals 3. And to give a brief reputation for, I think, what most people's conception of that universe would be, is that there is a difference between 1 plus 1 genuinely equaling 3 and 1 plus 1 equaling, for all intents and purposes, the number 2 masquerading as the number 3.
Yeah.
That is to say, we could call it 3, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be 3. And in that sense, I think, that's more or less everything I have to say. Yeah.
Agreed.
Can I put the finger in the wound?
Go for it.
So
Yeah.
is the following universe conceivable: a universe in which all well-formed formulas of integers have a truth value? To put the finger in the wound using Gödel's incompleteness theorem.
Can you explain that?
So Gödel's incompleteness theorem says that if all well-formed formulas in the integers have a truth value, let's say 1 plus 1 is 3. That's either true or false, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is a well-formed formula. If all well-formed formulas in integers have a truth value, then you can construct something that is both true and false. So it is either incomplete or contradictory.
It would be incomplete.
If you force it, it is either incomplete or contradictory. If you make it complete, if you make all things have truth value, then you can get a contradiction.
I think my response to this is probably going to sound kind of cop-outy, but I would ask you, what do you mean by conceive? And what do you mean by truth in this sense? Because, we can sort of get around, I'm not going to dance around and be like, oh, I don't know what truth means in the context of the sort of mathematical equations. But as I said before, in terms of in regards to directness being existing only as insofar as indirectness exists, and vice versa, I would argue, you would like the concept of truthness is also has falsity as a requisite, and so you make everything true. There's this something. Long story short, I would say it's nonsense. Nonsense for the lack of ability to, I think, have a conversation about this in language, but also because I think it would be inconceivable to humans. Whatever, and I'm making a few jumps here, but I think, again, Wittgenstein would ask, like, the first question out of his mouth would be, what do you mean by conceive? And what would it, what are you trying to get at by saying to successfully conceive a thing?
Yeah, what would unsuccessfully conceiving of something be?
Just not conceiving.
Can't do it.
So since you define since you put the limits of conceivable in everything, I don't know what the wording wasn't that it was mathematically sound, but what did you say? What is the limit of everything that could be compatible with? Was it first order logic or what kind of logic?
Non-contradictory to first order logic.
Okay. Okay, but in this case we are introducing into the set of integrals, so things will get more complicated. No, it gets messy.
Okay, well, I gotta go soon and do some other stuff now. But before we wrap up, right, end the recording, any final remarks, final things you guys want to say, or questions? Well, I'm excited to do part 3 because hopefully it's about, what is it? More philosophy stuff. Man with himself, man from within. So hopefully this stuff is more oh no, it looks like more Watson stuff. Well,
I have a question for everyone if maybe we want to end off on that note. Oddly enough, and I'll be like upfront about this. This was a question that ChatGPT generated, and I thought it was adequate enough, at least. If matter is just a summary of sensation, does that mean reality is subjective, or just our access to it is?
I would say the latter.
is if matter is just a summary of sensation, does that mean reality is subjective, or just that our access to it is?
Our
I'll copy
access.
paste and put it in the chat as well.
I would say our
Perhaps
access
it could be
is,
something.
but good, something to think about. Yeah.
The latter sounds very good.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I'll end it off there. I will